Diamond, Diamond.
A precious gem of the most valuable kind. When pure, it is clear.
Diamond, Diamond.
A family name bringing traditions of love, hard work, and moral values.
This is the Diamond Education Podcast with my mom and dad, Jon and Kellee, England.
Dear listeners, we just had a wonderful conversation with Jamie Buckland, who is from West Virginia and has worked very closely with lawmakers to implement the Hope Scholarship there. One of the things we failed to tell you about was the legal challenges that the Hope Scholarship has gone through. The Hope Scholarship was passed in 2021 and was set to be implemented this year for the upcoming school year, but ran into some legal troubles. And on Thursday, October 6th, the West Virginia Supreme Court came out and ruled against those who filed suit, saying that the Hope Scholarship is constitutional and can continue forward. So great news for them, and that will give you some great context for our upcoming discussion.
Welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast with Jon and Kellee, England, your hosts. We're here to help you find the most valuable education for your child.
We are excited today to have Jamie Buckland on our show. Jamie Buckland is a mom of 4 living in Flat Top, West Virginia. She began homeschooling her oldest son in 2007, and that love of teaching turned into the Appalachian Classical Academy. That experience led Jamie to helping other education entrepreneurs as a classical program consultant. Jamie is an education choice advocate, having lobbied for and passed a sports access bill for homeschoolers, and is now creating a grassroots movement in West Virginia to implement the Hope Scholarship, an education savings account that parents can use to individualize education. Jamie continues to work in West Virginia to help families navigate the education choice landscape. Her work connects families with the funds and providers that fit their family. Jamie, welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast.
Thank you so much to both of you for this invitation. I'm excited to get to talk.
Yeah, so we are excited. We had some news come out yesterday about the Hope Scholarship there in West Virginia. And so we've kind of had a little change of plans here with our podcast. So this podcast will actually be 2 parts, where we'll take the first part and just talk about the Hope Scholarship. So why don't you just take a moment and just give us kind of the background of the Hope Scholarship, how it started, and how you've been involved with that movement.
Sure. So in West Virginia, for years, we had homeschool, private school, public school. Those were the 3 basic options, and you needed to pick the one that worked for you, right? And so it was limiting. And so I like to say that for 15 years, families would say, well, public school isn't meeting our needs. What are our options? And if they couldn't afford private school tuition and they weren't in a position to educate at home, there just weren't really any other options for them. But about 6 or 7 years ago, our think tank here in West Virginia, the Cardinal Institute, they got to work building the miracle of West Virginia, as their executive director, Garrett Ballingy, would say. And I came across Garrett's work when they had introduced some legislation for the charter school movement, for a possible ESA, and the teachers had responded to that by going on strike. And so that is how I started Googling and searching for information on the charter school movement and the legislation surrounding that. And I got connected with Garrett, and he was interested in why I had been building these programs and serving the homeschoolers, in these communities, like what were the needs in the community, what led me to starting them. And so we began this relationship of figuring out how to expand school choice in West Virginia. And there were many other players. Jason Huffman from Americans for Prosperity, Senator Patricia Rucker has been our champion as a lawmaker. And so they introduced this and were able to pass it in 2021. And what it does is it provides a child who is leaving public school or rising up into kindergarten the state portion of the per pupil funding, roughly $4,300. And that parent can then choose how to spend those dollars with qualified providers.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool. So, I mean, you and I, we spoke a little bit at a conference just recently. And so one of the things I loved was your kind of conversation about why West Virginia needed that. So can you kind of explain that? And I'm totally talking over my wife too. I'm really good at doing that.
You guys kind of know this a little more. So I'm
That's
listening,
okay.
and I'm going to ask questions if I have them. So
That's what I figured.
Why did West Virginia need an ESA? Why did they need an education savings account in the state?
Yeah. We are kind of known for many different things, right? In one way, we're known for our resource of coal. So we're known for that one issue, but then we're also known for a lack of resources and for Appalachian generational ignorance, generational poverty. And, we recognize that we're kind of the butt of many jokes. And that reality is it's very heavy for those of us who feel like we're working to disrupt the systems that have kept us in that realm, if you will. And so when we look at the demographics and the families who can afford private school or to educate at home, they don't have a lot of reasons to stay in West Virginia. So trying to support families and encourage them to stay here was getting harder and harder when we weren't really recognizing the sacrifices that these families were making to choose private education. And at the same time, we have smaller rural communities where they don't have the resources. We have 12 out of 55 counties that don't even have a private school. So if you're a person that is in need of custodial care, right, you have to have an in-person option for your children. 12 out of our 55 counties don't even have a private school. And so you're very limited in what you would be able to choose. And we believe that the Hope Scholarship is going to be the vehicle that actually helps fund the launching of new private schools. And in West Virginia, we just would not have been able to do that any other way. So it really is a catalyst. It's going to be a key to the transformation of K-12 education in the Mountain State.
It's always interesting, the opposition, Jamie. What has the opposition been like there?
Yeah, sure. It's been all around. It's very circular. And so the opposition has not just been from teacher unions or those who would consider themselves pro-public education. We've also had opposition from the homeschooling community. We've had opposition from those who feel like they want the government completely out of education, and they believe, and then the others who believe we should fund the system and not necessarily fund the student. And I'm in a really privileged place because I'm not necessarily a political individual. Some may argue that, but I don't see myself that way. And so I feel like I've been in a position to help build relationships and have conversations that kind of removes a lot of those polarizing emotions when it comes to education and the political bent that it tends to have, and really just engage the opposition and ask them, what are you concerned about? And then really do a gut check. Like, so why am I in this movement? Why do I believe in school choice? Is this going to have an unintended consequence that could really be damaging years down the road? And I like to say that when I first got introduced to school choice, I asked Garrett a million questions and really told him to give me his best arguments for school choice. And then I went and interviewed teacher union reps and the teacher union president and principals and superintendents and asked them for their best arguments against school choice expansion. And at the end of the day, the arguments for it were more compelling. They were stronger. That's not to say that there aren't any concerns or that you don't need any guardrails. But for me, the argument to expand school choice was just a better argument.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've had similar in Utah. We were surprised.
Sure.
You expect the unions and the teachers. And then when we came out last year with the Hope Scholarship, all these, homeschooling, even these people are good friends. We were like, what is going on?
Right.
Yes. And really when it gets down to the end of the day, they have the choice whether to use it or not. It's not being forced upon them,
Yes.
And some of
what
us.
What I like to say to that is it is true, right? Like you can opt in or you can opt out. But what I hear from veteran homeschoolers, and I think is a really good point to make, is that it still affects their world. So a big distinction that I've noticed as a homeschooling mom of 15 years is that we largely run on volunteer efforts and volunteer operations. And so you have these giant homeschool advocates who have been literally sacrificing their money, their time, and their energy to build all volunteer programs and work. And like, we have a state organization here that has a hotline for homeschoolers, right? So somebody is voluntarily doing all of that. Wow. When you bring in an ESA and tell people that they're homeschooling, they're just homeschooling with an ESA, which I've been very clear, it's not homeschooling. I've been very protective over that language, because you create more work, like you make their job harder, and none of them are getting compensated in any way. Whereas it is a reality that in the school choice world, there is funding for a lot of these programs and a lot of the effort that goes into school choice. And so for them, it feels a lot like, yes, we could opt out, but you're still making our life harder. You're still bringing on something. Is the juice going to be worth the squeeze? They also have concerns that even though the language looks good right now, which it does for Hope Scholarship, and we can talk a little bit about that if it's interesting to you, what's it look like to educate at home with the ESA versus what does it look like to be under the homeschool exemption? They look very similar, but that's not to say that if the legislative body takes a swing and someone else is now in a supermajority and that shifts or that changes, then there is this concern that families would have become dependent upon that income. They would be homeschooling under that ESA. And now all of a sudden there are strings that feel more like a rope than a thread, right? There are always strings that are attached. To some people, it feels like a rope. To some people, it feels like a thread. And it's up to that individual family to figure out what the distinctions are. But there is that concern that this would position families to then become dependent upon the government. And a tried and true mantra of homeschoolers is that it is parent funded, parent directed, and their power to the individual parent. And so this removes a bit of that and makes it uncomfortable for them. I believe we can coexist in most states, but I also acknowledge that there are states who have tremendous freedoms when it comes to homeschooling, and carving them out is going to be much harder than it was in West Virginia. In West Virginia, we could easily carve out homeschoolers and say you're opting out. But what we're finding in other states who have more broad freedom in their homeschool law, you have to begin to define homeschooling if you're going to carve it out. And that makes homeschoolers very uncomfortable.
That's an excellent point. And something like,
because Utah does have a few more options right now, I think, than West Virginia does. You know, we've got the one for kids on IEPs and kids for disabilities. And then we have a few different, like My Tech High, that pulls from a school to, so so you can kind of see.
And have you guys seen some resistance when families choose that My Tech High? How have there been some sectors that kind of are uncomfortable with homeschoolers choosing that?
So I think My Tech High has become this a normal part of our kind of homeschool community. I mean, people will call themselves homeschoolers and use My Tech High, even though they're having to do some of the stuff they have to do is this weekly report, where if you're what I would call a true homeschooler, you're not using the My Tech High funds, right? And so you don't have to do those those reports or anything like that. And so I think that does kind of make this distinction. And so for Utah, with and we named it the Hope Scholarship after West Virginia's because it was so inspiring. And just we really wanted to basically improve the people who are choosing to use My Tech High and make it a lot more accessible for them, because it is that thing, and make it easier for people who are in the public system coming into into a My Tech High type situation, and ours would roughly be about $4,000 per student. So
because with My Tech High, we get, is it around 18?
Yeah, we get like $1,800.
Because we actually use My Tech High and we use the ESA with one of our kids, but with the My Tech High, like my kids who are third party, we're doing it through a private school, get like $2,000. And then my kids at home, it's between 16 and 1,800.
I think it's like
so it's quite a bit less, which is quite frustrating because the district gets a cut. And plus
Yeah.
my tech high, which my tech high should get a cut, but
Yeah.
it would be nice to get the pupil funding that
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
state.
or at least
Right.
closer to of
Yeah.
what the state's spending. So
Yeah.
so Utah's, I mean, we've consistently been on the bottom of like the per pupil spending in the nation, right? We had like 2 years where Idaho was spending less than we were, and now Idaho's back up above us in per pupil spending, and we're only at like, we just barely hit $10,000 per student that we're spending,
Okay.
and that includes all the federal, local, and state
Okay.
funds that we're doing. And so it's, I mean, compared to some states I know, like in Pennsylvania, it's like $22,000 that they're
What's
spending
West
per student.
Virginia?
Yeah,
West Virginia averages around 13,000, 12, 13,000
Okay.
is the latest number that I've heard. And so you've got those three revenue streams, the federal funding, the local funding, and then that state fund portion, that per pupil funding is an average of $4,600. And then there is a 5% administrative fee that was written into the law to ensure that the treasurer's office was able to implement the program and we're contracted with Step Up for Students out of Florida. And so that 5% helps to cover that administrative fee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that
Yeah.
totally makes sense.
You
So,
mentioned, and I want to hear the difference when you're talking about possibly the bill language and all that,
Sure.
Jamie.
Yeah. So I love talking about this because traditionally homeschoolers are familiar with the MyTech model. They're familiar with virtual charter schools. They're familiar with the charter option in California, where you can't use any of those funds for any materials that are faith-based, and you
Yeah.
can't sign up for a faith-based program, right? What is so cool about the West Virginia law and getting to be with the individuals who crafted that law over the last couple of days was really humbling to get to sit there and listen to them talk about how it all came together when they first started writing it. But so the difference for Hope Scholarship is that it's not attached to any type of requirement like that. So the homeschoolers, when we first started talking about Hope Scholarship, they were like, well, we wouldn't want that. You couldn't use it for this curriculum. You couldn't use it for this program. The hybrid homeschool program that I run, Appalachian Classical Academy, is a faith-based program. So,
Right.
they were saying you wouldn't be able to use it for that. But the reality is you can. A qualified provider is not going to be discriminated against for being faith-based. That's not a disqualifier. So that was one key issue that we were meeting from homeschool opposition, that we said, we hear you. We hear that that's the concern in California. That's the concern with these others. It's not the concern here. So that was one big main point. And then when you get into the actual application of the homeschool part, so Hope Scholarship has kind of two pathways, if you will. You can use those funds to pay for your private school tuition. And so school providers can be recipients or providers for the Hope Scholarship. And then you could have like service providers. So somebody who's offering therapy services or music lessons, and they would be service providers. And then of course you have it on materials, on approved materials. So those are kind of the three buckets where you can spend your Hope dollars within that. But under the pathway, you're either choosing to send that money directly to the private school, or if you choose and your assessment would be under that private school, whatever assessment they do to satisfy the state criteria, or you can choose to educate at home. And they gave it not the best name in the world, Individualized Instructional Program, or IIP, which for those who are familiar with IEPs, like,
so
not the best.
Probably got
name.
confused with like special needs students and things like that. Oh, they're the only ones that can use it. I could totally see that.
Yes. So that's the IIP option. And if you choose the instructional or the individualized instructional program, then you're basically educating at home, and your assessment piece can be a standardized test, or it can be a portfolio review where a certified teacher takes a look at the work that you've completed over the year and signs off on that. So under that IIP, you're considered educating at home, and you get to do the a la carte unbundling of, I'm going to use this math curriculum, we're going to sign up for this, right? So that's the comparison. So under the Hope Scholarship, under those two pathways, I'm not comparing the private school part because that's completely different. But the IIP to homeschool, both of them require the child to be educated in 5 subjects: math, reading, language arts, science, and social studies. So that's identical to the homeschool law. They both require an end of year assessment, which is the standardized test or that portfolio review. What they don't, where they begin to be set apart and not have in common is homeschoolers are required to assess every single year, but we're not required to submit that assessment every single year under the homeschool exemption. We submit it in 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th. Under the IIP, which I think is completely acceptable and reasonable, you submit that assessment every single year because you're getting $4,300 of state dollars for that education. And so that's where they begin to be different. So you're still going to submit a notice of intent for an exemption from compulsory attendance. You're still required to teach in those 5 subjects, assess in those 5 subjects. You're just actually turning it in every year instead of not. The other key issue that's near and dear to my heart is the sports access. Right now, because of the legislation that we were able to work on, a traditional homeschooler under the homeschool exemption does have sports access by taking a class at their local public school, a virtual course. They don't have to attend in person, but that's their pathway to access for sports, whereas an IIP Hope Scholar does not currently have that pathway. And so for student athletes, there could be a reason why they wouldn't want to consider the Hope Scholarship, because they could have that as a homeschooler where they wouldn't as an IIP student.
Wow. Oh, that's a bummer. Like, because in Utah, they get to participate no matter what, you know.
They don't even have to have a class from the school or anything.
So, yeah.
I have a list of things, like my wish list of things that we would like to change and improve upon, and just continue to remove those barriers and continue to ensure that we are able to meet the needs of families as we are identifying them, figuring out, okay, well, what needs change? What do we need to do to free up this market and to make sure that families are able to access these options?
Yeah. That's good job, Jamie. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's way awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you have an organization, West Virginia Families United for Education. And so can you tell us a little bit about what your organization does in regards to, you know, all this education choice goodness?
Sure. Yeah. The West Virginia FUE. So the FUE, the proud, the hopeful. That's what they're saying, what we're saying right now.
I love it.
So when I got started in this realm,
and to be honest, as a former Marine, I really love it.
That's right. That's right. I just remembered that. So hopefully they don't come after me for any type of infringement. It is FUE. It's not FEW. So we do have some people come up and say the FUE, and I'm like, no, it's the FUE. But when I started this work in November, I was just kind of on my own for my own platform for the work that I had been doing for homeschoolers. But I knew that I would not be effective and that the work would not be validated until I was able to secure other parent advocates, if you will, across the state with a like-minded mission to really get behind the work that we were going to do. And so I began traveling the state, and I would find somebody that I had a connection with. I'd set them up as the organizer of the event, and I would go out there and do a workshop, not to talk about Hope Scholarship, but to talk about all K-12 options. So I had a whole slideshow presentation, and I would talk about compulsory education and then the exemptions from compulsory education. Because I think when your state law is going to administrate or mandate compulsory education, we really need to get that framework framework in our minds when we start talking about removing them with those exemptions, because that's the very basis of the ESA. It's an exemption from compulsory attendance. So I began traveling the state and I began identifying, I said it was like I was gathering the Avengers or assembling the Avenger team because I was finding all of these powerhouses. My secretary is a private school administrator who has been just a champion of special needs students in Preston County, West Virginia, Christine, and she has been fighting for special needs students. Their school serves largely the special needs community, a private school. And I mean, again, this scholarship just is going to be an unbelievable resource for them to be able to better serve those families. The chairman of our board, Melinda Royce, is someone I've known for probably close to a decade. She has been in the position where she has 3 daughters and she's having to figure out, okay, are we homeschooling this year? Are we doing private school this year? What are our options? How do we access them? Do you have speech therapy when you're homeschooling? No. And so trying to figure out what all those options, and she also has student athletes, so she's always been keeping up to date on my work with student athletes. And then Teresa Newman is our treasurer, who is a homeschool mom. She and I used to run a gym program here in Southern West Virginia for the middle school and high school. We would teach them how to play volleyball and pick up basketball and that kind of thing. And so I began to assemble the Avengers, and we wanted to figure out a way to ensure that every parent has quality options, right? So that's part of like activating the supply. So we want to make sure that every family has quality options, that they know about them, that they can access them, that they have access to a guide who can help them. A lot of what I do is consulting a family, you know, so do you need in-person care? Do you not need in-person care? A lot of our families will keep their children at home, but they don't want to be the full-time instructor. Well, then a virtual charter might be the best choice for them. And so giving them access to someone who can do that flow chart kind of in their mind, it's exciting because we're getting ready to hire some staff for me so that I can train them to kind of do that process that I've been doing myself. And so that's what we do is support the family. And then on the provider side, if you're starting a school in West Virginia, it's a little bit of a scavenger hunt to get all of the pieces that you need to figure out how do you have an exemption for your school to enroll students. And so we're working with new micro schools, learning pods, homeschool groups, virtual charters are reaching out to us, brick and mortar charters. So just building on the skill set that I've had to kind of grow over the last 15 years out of necessity, I'm now getting to use all of that to really serve our communities.
That's awesome.
You've done a lot, Jamie.
Yeah.
I'm like, how are you balancing this?
That's a great question. And I would say I'm not. And so a dear friend of mine a couple years ago said, like, there is no balance. There's only harmony, and there will be crescendos, and there will be, you know, points where you've got a very staccato beat, and then things will flow more smoothly. And I definitely feel that way. But I do know that. So I do have these 4 kids, right? Like 21, 19, 11, and 5. So I've graduated these 2 homeschoolers, and they have been so supportive of me, my older daughter and son, and just saying that, like, you know, you did this work for us and you provided us this education and you provided us these programs, and now you have the opportunity to see other families. But I don't want that to come at the sacrifice of my 11-year-old and my 5-year-old. So in full transparency, I have a fantastic nanny. A lot of people think, well, is she truly homeschooling her kids and running around the state and doing all of this work? And no, I have someone that's in my home who I trust, who's helping make sure that the kids get their instruction and are fed and have clean clothes. So it's been a shock to our lifestyle because it's not the way that we're used to things for the last 15 years. But I feel like God has called me to this, to be quite honest. And so I'm just trusting that he knows more than I do, and he's got it figured out.
That's awesome.
I love it. I actually, there was another busy mom here in Utah that's doing a lot, you know, but she's, you know, has older kids and is approaching the grandma state, you know. And I asked her, I'm like, how do you do it? Like, you know, because some days I'm just barely getting through the day with homeschooling my kids. But
well, there
she was
are
like-
seasons. Yeah, there
Yeah.
are seasons,
Oh, for
right? And
sure.
I can remember when I just had the older kids, I can remember thinking like, oh, I'm going to get to do this, and I'm going to get to do that. And then we had our second set. And when we had them, you know, it really, I had to take a step back. I couldn't do all the things, and I had to know like there's a season. And so it just feels like this season has come up, and we're ready to get to work.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
awesome.
Well, and I love your faith behind it too, because she actually said similar thing. I pray every day what the Lord wants me to do, and that's what I do that day. And I was like,
Absolutely.
that's what
Yeah.
you can do, right?
Yes.
So
No, that is awesome. So this is going to end our part one, Jamie. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity if you can just maybe tell our audience how they can connect with you. And then next week we will have our part two, which we'll record in just a minute. But
Yes, that's right.
yeah, so if you want to just
Okay.
tell our audience how they can connect with you and kind of follow your work, that would be amazing.
Sure. So the downside about being so busy is we've not had time to actually put together a quality website, but you
Oh.
can go to our website to sign up for updates. It is www.wvfue.org, the West Virginia FUE. And so you can find our website there, but we are embarrassingly easy to find on socials. So we have our largest following. We're meeting the parents where they are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can hunt us down. Jamie Buckland is easy to find. The West Virginia FUE is easy to find. You can also email me at jamie@wvfue.org. So happy to interact and happy to take questions from others across the nation that are finding themselves interested in school choice.
awesome. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you for listening to the Diamond Education Podcast.
You can connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
At Diamond Education, DIMOND, or on our website, diamonded.com.